If you look into the history, the Nordic market was the origin of the power trading. It was our role model when we started back in the days, how we can do the trading here. Germany was somehow interesting because when the liberalization started, they opened the market directly for the households, which was not very often given. So market liberalization was the competition around the household and of course the trading part.
How do you take all these facts into account in the modeling, and how do you then support your clients in right decision makings, and who are your clients? Is it asset based? Is it traders?
We have in Montel, it's not only that we are having 4 TSOs, we are having 900 DSOs in Germany. That's why the market was always interesting for every player to enter the German market. Today the market price development is integrated, which is really interesting, and it makes it a bit easier to model. It's a bit complicated when you come to flow-based market coupling, which is today's standard. Before that, we had the net transfer capacities. We must understand that in the day-ahead market, we have an auction system and not a continuous trading, which then we have in the intraday market, but also on the long-term market.
Today with us, Tobias Federico. Welcome, Tobias.
Hello.
Thank you for being here today. Let's start with a short introduction. You're Tobias, currently at Montel Energy Brainpool, formerly Energy Brainpool. Can you give us a short intro on who you are, your experience, what did you do, and where are we now?
Okay, perfect. No, I would love to do so. So my name is Tobias Federico. Sometimes people call me the dinosaur of the energy market, at least in Germany. Maybe I'm a landfish, so a bit older even. I started working in the energy sector in 1998 in April, and I remember that because that was the official month when the German electricity market has been liberalized under the EU directive. I was an engineer from education, but I had a lucky situation that I was working on a consultancy with a consultancy, and they did build up the power exchange in Germany. So, which for me was the starting point. I can trade power. How can I trade power if I can't store power? I could ask the initial question, how can we trade the electricity? What's important to trade it? What's the separation between the grid and the trading itself? And from there it started. Then I was back at university because I wanted to understand what are price effects on, or what is influencing prices. I was starting modeling. And when the exchanges started in the year 2000, I had the first spot price forecasts, which was quite exciting. Then I was working for a Norwegian portfolio management company. And in the year 2003, I was inspired by one company in Norway, which was purely providing analytics without actively trading on the market, which was quite rare in the beginning of the 2000s. So I founded Energy Brainpool with 3 pillars mostly. One is training, so explain to people how the market works. The second part was really the modeling and forecasting, and the third part was the consultancy. And these were the 3 pillars. And in the year 2024, I sold Energy Brainpool to Montel, and now it's part of the Montel Group, enriching the Montel Group mostly on the long-term scenarios and forecasts.
Thank you for that introduction. And how has 𝐜𝐴 been now as part of the Montel Group?
𝐜𝐴 itself was exciting as every year. Actually, again, the dinosaur part. It was my 26th 𝐜𝐴.
Wow.
And it's increasing. It was amazing. I think we had 37,000 participants with 1,100 exhibitors, more or less, if I'm not wrong. So it's increasing every year. And next year, the 𝐜𝐴 will expand to 2 additional halls. And then Messe Essen is full, so 𝐜𝐴 can't grow anymore. For Montel itself, it was exciting as ever. And we have an internal benchmark is at what time are we running out of our beer? And we have been running out of our beer on the first evening at 11 o'clock, and we ordered 10% more than last year, which for us is always the benchmark, how full it was on the booth. But 𝐜𝐴 is always a very interesting thing. You can show your products, you can show what are the new developments, and you get a mood of the market already quite early in the beginning of the year, which is quite important.
And as we all know, _e_world is in Germany, is in Essen, and I would like to look a bit more at the German market. You gave the introduction already. You were part of the early liberalization of the German energy market, the first exchanges, forecasting. Can you walk us through how was the German market unique in the whole liberalization within Europe? And also, why does Germany have such a strong presence, basically one of the core European markets in many aspects, politically, liquidity, you name it. Where does it all come from, that strong presence?
It's quite interesting because usually if you look into the history, the Nordic market was the origin of the power trading, and it was our role model when we started back in the days, how we can do the trading here. Germany was somehow interesting because when the liberalization started, they opened the market directly for the households, which was not very often given. So market liberalization was the competition around the household and of course the trading part. Germany was dominated quite a lot by big players. We had four big players back in the days, which still are big today, but of course they split up over time. But nevertheless, these big companies built up trading floors and were mostly trading their core market. I think what Germany did quite well was in an early separation of the grid and the power trading. And secondly, that they allowed a lot of market participants really to start trading on the exchanges. We also had a competition with exchanges in the beginning. I don't know if you're aware of, but in the year 2000, we had four power exchanges, at least initiatives. Two of them continued. One was the LPX in Leipzig, and the other one was the EEX in Frankfurt. And after a while, they merged. So we had one power exchange then. And I think if you look into the total market, Germany has the highest power consumption, has the highest generation all over Europe, mostly, and it's dominating continental Europe. We separate the markets a bit, like we have Italy, which is always a bit special. Then we have the Iberian Peninsula. We have the UK market, with definitely special, the Nordics, but the rest of the market is mostly dominated by the price development in Germany, as we have a lot of cross-border exchanges, and then Germany is one of the most countries of the countries with the most cross-border capacities and most surrounding countries in Europe, which makes it quite special. And in the end, trading volume did increase, I think, 10 times the total electricity demand. And that's quite unique. So the total churn rate, if you call it that, power will be traded 10 times more than it will be consumed, mostly on the long-term markets, of course, and that makes it special. So a lot of liquidity, a lot of political stability, which sometimes is important. And I think that it's not a secret recipe, but these were the reasons.
Well spoken, Tobias. You mentioned, of course, the split between owning the grid and the trading participants, and that brings us to a bit of power market history 1.0. Can you talk the audience through, and it's specifically a big chunk of the audience is also new, relatively new to the energy markets, might not be familiar with the whole history. So Germany is already unique with the four German TSOs, of course. Can you just walk us through why is it like that? How was it before? Where did it originate from? Can you walk us through?
Absolutely. I always welcome to that. The thing is, it's not only that we are having four TSOs, we are having 900 DSOs in Germany. And that is a huge number. That's why the market was always interesting for every player to enter the German market. The reason for that, I think, I often, when I do my education, I'm showing a map of what today is Germany from 1700s, with all the little tiny kingdoms and little cities and so on. And then I show a map of today's DSOs. And they are scattered. It looks almost the same. And I think in parts it's a bit of the federal structure we're having in Germany, that we are not centralizing things. It's distributed quite a lot. And every tiny little city has its own municipality, so its own utility, but they're so small that we call them municipality. And that makes it seems to make it a bit more complicated, but enriches the whole landscape. The four DSOs actually back in the days were eight. So we started with 8 DSOs, but then the German government, who owned a few of them in Eastern Germany, were selling them. And the rules have been that it should have been sold only to a German company. And there was a DSO in the city of Hamburg, owned by Vattenfall. So the the TSO of Hamburg bought then the grid of Eastern Germany and of the city of Berlin and became Vattenfall, what we as know today. And the grid then has been split up and it's today 50 hertz. Then we had several mergers. So two merged, which was Bayernwerk and Preußen Elektra, to what today is known as TenneT TSO. And then we are having the two others, which is Amprion and from the EnBW Transnet BW. So in the end, we end up with 4 TSO, which is quite unique in Europe. But still, they're working quite strongly together, and it does not really hinder the trading, as in the end, you only need to split up just before the physical delivery all your trades. So usually you need to have a balancing agreement with each of the TSOs, but you have a favorite TSO balancing group where you are trading in before the physical delivery. And just rewrite for the physical delivery a few hours, a few days before, you split that up between the 4 different ones when you want to deliver physically the power.
Thank you for walking us through on that one. And one of the earlier topics that you mentioned was the connectivity of Germany, of course. Lots of neighbors, lots of cross-border connections. That's also, of course, interesting from this whole TSO standpoint, because there it is all about physical presence. One step back, Germany is rolled in the European system. You mentioned, of course, the development, but can you also look a bit here at the fuel mix? Because the fuel mix has massively developed as well. Of course, very lignite and nuclear driven to very renewables. Can you walk us through on how that has been and a bit of the political lowlights and highlights during the whole transition over, let's say, the last 15 to 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, when in this case, I'm happy to look backward, but often we look also forward. And in the forward looking, I'm explaining the history by 4 different approaches, which is we have a French approach, we have the German approach, we have the Polish approach, and no, in the end it's 3, sorry for that. And maybe you can also look into the Nordics, which would be then the 4th one. The end is that you mostly had a dominating power technology, which usually comes from the history. We should always remember that when you build up conventional power plants, but even fluctuating renewables, these assets will be around for minimum 20, 25 years, 30 years. If we look into French nuclear power plants, for example, there might be around in the future maybe 100 years and are already there for 60 years. So you have long-term decisions on your power mix itself. In France, of course, it was nuclear energy at a certain point, but the nuclear energy was not enough really to cover the demand spikes France has, especially in cold waves in wintertime. So that's why they had oil-fired power plants or gas-fired power plants as classical peakers. In Germany, the approach was mostly back in the days on available national resources, which was lignite, which is quite unique in Germany. We have a bit of that also in Poland, and hard coal, as we had still have a lot of hard coal resources, but it's very expensive really to mine those in Germany. That's why we mostly are importing them since more or less 20 years. And of course, we had a nuclear mix also in Germany, and for peakers, we used gas. Poland, for example, has mostly fossil fuels, which is lignite and hard coal and some gas. And you can see this on the building years of different power plants, especially now for Germany. Those older power plants are mostly from the 50s and 60s, are hard coal and lignite. In the 70s, we started quite a lot with nuclear energy, as was thought that nuclear energy would be the future back in the days. And actually, funnily enough, when I was working here as an internship back in the days in the local TSO, I discovered a plan to build up a nuclear power plant in the city of Berlin. So just imagine that, building a nuclear power plant in the middle of the city, but back in the days in the 70s, this was quite normal. And then we had the agreement with Russia regarding natural gas. And the natural gas delivery was quite huge in the end until the invasion to the Ukraine. And based on that, we've built up in Germany a natural gas mix, which was mostly peakers, so gas turbines, but also combined cycle gas turbines, CCGTs, which are quite highly efficient, especially if you use them for heating, district heating. And in Poland, of course, then it was their mix. Germany made a decision at a certain point to make the so-called energy transition, which means that we want to go away from fossil fuels into, let's say, green fuels. I'm saying this in this way. I would not like to say it's CO2 or low CO2 emissions. In the end, that's it. I mean, it's about against the climate change and climate neutrality. That's why we started, I think 25 years ago with the first wind farms. And back in the days, we had 2% of our energy mix based on fluctuating renewables. Today, it's more than 50%. I think it was 54% last year. Mostly wind and solar, and a bit of wind offshore and wind onshore. Not so much hydro. In the Nordics, for example, especially Norway, they have 96% hydro production. In Sweden, they have hydro and they have nuclear power plants. And in Finland, of course, they have nuclear power plants and some biomass. So each country had their own political decision, which then affects the fuel mix, and the fuel mix then affects also the price pattern on the day-ahead market.
Looking at this price pattern on the day-ahead market and also the effect of the fuel mix, we're already thinking, of course, merit order. And I want to make a little step here outside of the box. We are in a pretty efficient market right now, and there I'm suggesting the 𝐓𝐚𝐴 algorithm, of course, market coupling, cross-border optimizations. But can you also tell us how it was before, when there was no coupling yet? You started about modeling. Independent local power exchanges, cross-border flows, and how did you model that? Was it like all manual merit forecasts per country and then be active on the cross-border, or how was it back then?
Well, today the market price development is integrated, which is really interesting, and it makes it a bit easier to model. It's a bit complicated when you come to flow-based market coupling, which is today's standard. Before that, we had the net transfer capacities, but still it was a so-called intrinsic auction. We must understand that in the day-ahead market, we have an auction system and not a continuous trading, which then we have in the intraday market, but also on the long-term market. For us as modeler, and I always say modelers make their world very easy because a model is always the reduction of the complexity of the reality, which means I must ignore certain effects in reality to be able to model stuff. And intrinsically, a model is wrong. And that's a fact. Yeah? Every model is wrong. Every model has its mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes are a bit lower than it's a good model. Coming back to how was the market design? Of course, we had the day-ahead market, and you have different modeling approaches. If you have a stack model, then you're simulating the merit order. You can also do this econometric-wise. With a time series model, then you ignore a bit the stack model, but you must play around with something like mean reversion. That's quite statistic, but you have to have a different modeling approach. And then the challenge was, how does it really work with the cross-border trading? We had the challenge back in the days, and we did this in 2 steps, as you mentioned. We simulated econometrically the different markets in the first step. And after that, we simulated rational behavior in cross-border exchanges. So then we expected that from a low-price country, electricity would flow to a high-price country, as it says, buy low, produce low, sell high. The reality, as it was not coupled and decoupled, and you had to first bid on the intraday capacity for the cross-border exchange and then bid on the day-ahead market. I call it intraday because the TSOs had certain capacities for themselves to stabilize the flow and gave only parts of that on a daily basis to the market. And sometimes we had illogical flows. So electricity was flowing from the high price zone to the low price zone, which doesn't really make sense. And this was a huge risk for traders, and they had to trade on two different markets. That's why, and I can't recall the year, but it was 2005, 6, something like that. We started with the market coupling, so the integrated auction between major countries. In today's world, it's a bit easier to simulate and also to trade, but still some countries, sometimes we have illogical flows in the end, but that's a different reason, and it's not connected to the day-ahead market.
Then we go into the efficiencies of the algorithm, how to optimize the welfare.
Yes.
Yeah. A bit more about efficiencies. I am going here towards the grid constraints in Germany, challenges in optimizing congestion, and bringing us back, of course, about the increase over all these years of the renewable production. In the beginning, you also said the politics rather stable in Germany. We have these 4 different TSOs, they're coupled in price, but there's always the conversation on should there be different price zones within the German market. What do you think about that?
Well, I have a strong opinion that in that case, but before I start with that, maybe explain a bit. We have more or less 3 different approaches. One approach is we have one national price zone. Often it's called a copper plate, which I don't really like as a name, but you ignore grid congestions within a country. The second approach is the so-called zonal pricing, where you more or less split up a bigger area into a limited number of zones. Within that zone, we still ignore congestions, grid congestions, but within a given nation or even within a given TSO, you need to transfer electricity from one zone to another, and you have different prices there. The Nordics are a very nice example for that. Italy is a nice example where it works quite well, let's say. But the question is, why do we do that? And the next approach, which usually is not done in Germany, mostly in the US, is nodal pricing. That then comes down to every grid connection point, in theory, could be its own pricing area. Practicality shows, especially in the US, that you have preferred trading zones, trading nodes, where you most do your trades on, and then you trade contract for differences, mostly on a financial basis or future basis, to hedge yourself on the node where you are physically located. Germany, as federalism is quite strong, despite of these 900 municipalities, we don't want to have any discrimination on wholesale electricity prices, depending on where you're located. So that's why Germany always said, we are one price zone. We are this one copper plate. And when it comes to that, even what we should remember and not forget is that the German price zone was including the Austrian price zone. So it was the German-Austrian price zone. This is one step. The other thing is that parallel on that, we did increase the fluctuating renewable. Mostly we started with wind, and then we started with solar energy. And we did build up a lot of wind farms in the north and a lot of solar farms in the south of Germany. The problem is that most of the demand areas is not in the north. The power demand is in the middle of Germany and a little bit on the south. So somehow electricity needed to flow from north to south, and for that we needed to have the grid architecture. I spoke about how slow decisions sometimes are when it comes to fuel mix, that it takes 20, 30 years to make a decision. When it comes to grid pattern and how to construct grids, that even takes much longer, and they are lasting for even longer. So the grid development was slower than the installed capacities of fluctuating renewables. So instead of electricity, and as electricity only flows the way of the lowest resistance, flowing through Germany to the south, in case we had a lot of wind in the north, or the other way around, it flow around Germany. So to Poland, from Poland to the Czech Republic, and then to Bavaria. And those loop flows have not been very well received by our neighbors, where they said, no, that doesn't work. We need to split up the German zone from the Austrian zone. But still we have loop flows. And still we have the issue in Germany that our grid development is slower than the development of fluctuating renewables. So our neighboring countries are not very happy about that. until we are building up a so-called power line highways, a DC line from the North Germany to the South Germany. Having said that, one solution, at least on a political level, was, hey, let's split up the price zone, Germany into price zones, especially because we are also having issues in ramping up conventional power plants. If I'm explaining this to my aunt, for example, she's 80 years old, why is that happening? I always say that we have like a wind belt in the north of Germany, we have a conventional power belt in the middle of Germany, and we have a solar belt in the south of Germany. And as the conventional power plants are feeding in the middle of the grid, they need to ramp down to let electricity flow from north to the south or from south to the north. And as the grid topography is not really very well, we have a lot of ramping up and down, the so-called redispatch, and that costs a lot of money. And one argument is in zonal pricing that we can avoid redispatch costs. For my personal opinion, physical flow will be the same. After splitting up into price zones, and the discussions are between 1 price zone and 5 price zones in Germany. So redispatch costs will still be there, but they are hidden then in the prices and not seen as an extra cost. First, my argument against also zonal pricing, and I know that Montel being a Nordic company, I have a lot of internal discussion also with my colleagues in the Nordics, that especially in Norway, the argument, and they have zonal pricing since 30, 35 years, that with different price zones, there's an incentive to build cross-border capacities to reduce the potential price gaps, but nothing has been built in Norway. So in Germany, a price zone will not lead to additional grid investments for zonal cross-border capacities, or cross-zonal capacities. And one other example is, well, yeah, then with lower prices in the north, you have an incentive for the German industry to move to the north. Well, I always say that might be right, but it's not always the power, it's also about the people. And I can't imagine that BMW, the Bavarian motor factory, will move to the north and then be called Hamburg Motor Factory.
It has something
That
to
will
do
not
as well
happen.
with culture and where you're from, right? You cannot just
Right.
really take the identity of a company nor a factory and physically move it.
And it's a labor cost. It's also not only connection to the power grid, connection to the gas grid. It's the connection to the highway, your additional manufacturers which are close by to your factory, and so on. So it's more complicated than just the power.
And we have seen last year, I think, record levels of curtailment. You mentioned the high amount of the redispatch, very, very costly. Would you say that that is a result of lack of north-south interconnection, or is the lack of flexibility, or what is the main issue here that's driving these peak redispatch?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, honestly. First of all, if in case we would have much more grid connections, we could use the existing overproduction, just call it this way, to avoid curtailments in a lot of areas within Germany. And that could help a lot. Nevertheless, with the plans of the German government to have a significant amount, 80% by the year 2030 of fluctuating renewables, by the way, I don't think that we are getting there, but that's another discussion. It's a challenge. So the grid connection won't be that. So we need much more flexibility in the market. And flexibility can be a lot of things. Of course, these days we are talking a lot about BESS, batteries, but it could also be load shifting. It could be other electricity storage facilities, or any type of flexibility which could help us. But still, I would say, even with the given flexibility, if we utilize that more and the additional batteries, the growth path for fluctuating renewable, especially in Germany, is higher than the growth path of BESS. And so therefore, we still have a bit the issue, we still have the effect of redispatch, and we will not get rid of that because the grid system has been built on a thermal power plant approach 50 years ago and cannot adapt as quickly as the development of the power plants.
So on what time scale will we still be seeing then these high amounts of redispatch due to increasing higher renewable penetration? Are you thinking 5 years, 20 years? What is your feeling?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, taking the example of the belt, so I never really thought about it, but if you take the example of the power plant belt in the middle of Germany, with a coal phase out, especially lignite phase out, 2030, we will not have this centralized, in Germany, central production of conventional power plants. As I expect, especially with gas turbines, that there will be a bit more scattered around Germany, that the redispatch amount will be reduced anyhow, especially if we take batteries into account. I think batteries will help us a lot, but there will always be a redispatch somehow.
Yeah. Of course, the grid will need to remain balanced, of course, and there will always be a spread of production and consumption to some effect. My previous question was asked from the perspective of what are your feelings, but of course within Energy Brainpool, you also do the modeling, and you're talking about long-term price forecast and PPAs. How do you take all these facts into account in the modeling, and how do you then support your clients in right decision makings? And who are your clients? Is it asset based? Is it traders? Is it investors? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, we have in Montel a lot of products. When it comes to Montel Energy Brainpool, we are mostly known for the long-term scenarios, where we also have a time scale, which is the tradable period, which we call midterm. So midterm is anything from month ahead until, I would say, the next 10 years, but then we can discuss how liquid is the market in +4 years or even +3 years. But still, when we come to the midterm, that's then mostly traders and hedgers and also procurement strategies. But that is something where we see on the traded prices already a lot of information in their prices. It becomes quite exciting when we go beyond the classical trading period. And I would say that's 4 years ongoing, even though on the exchange we are having the settlement prices, but these are market maker prices. And I wouldn't say much more, I guess that's a bit wrong. But still, of course, it should be based somehow fundamentally until the year 2060. And that's the sweet spot of Energy Brainpool. When we come to the year 2060, it's always interesting when I speak to the potential customers that they say, yeah, but how can you do a price forecast until 2060 if you can't forecast the price of tomorrow? And that's right. And that's why we don't speak about price forecasts, we're speaking about scenarios. And the interesting thing with a scenario is that we have different scenario worlds. How can the energy world look like in the year 2060? For example, we have one scenario which we call Go Hydrogen, which shows that everything in the year 2060 will be based on hydrogen. I don't ask the question if that's likely or not. It's just imagine an energy world based on hydrogen. Or a scenario Go Nuclear. Just imagine an energy world within Europe based on nuclear energy. I'm not saying that that's quite likely, but at least it could be interesting to see how power prices are developing into this direction. Then we have our central case, which usually, of course, it's not business as usual, but current political decisions. And we have one case which has been developed in the year 2022 and still quite valid. It's called the tension case, where we have a lot of geopolitical risks into that scenario.
That sounds accurate right now.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. Yeah. So you build up a scenario world. In the moment where you build it up, you say, well, it's not really likely. But after a while, you see, hey, and that's the most, I would say, it's closest to reality now, the tension scenario, rather than the central case. And that's interesting. So we have the different scenario worlds, and then we have our projection, we call it. So how we're coming from today to the target year 2060. And these projections are the input parameters into the model. And the output is one path to the scenario world 2060, and we call that a scenario. And that's in this case, we have to really take a few things into account. Coming back to the point, a model is always the reduction of the complexity of the reality. We can't cover everything. We are very often getting the question, what's with small molecule reactors, so the SMRs in Germany. We are getting the question, especially in Germany, what's about fusion reactors? Are they coming or not? I mean, 2060 is quite long in the future, but it's not that far away, honestly. So is it likely or not? That could be a scenario world. And therefore, we must look into the grid connection, the growth of fluctuating renewables, the growth of batteries, cross-border capacities, as I said, some political decisions. So are we still having a phase out of different technologies? What's with CHP? Is that an issue or not? Because that influences then really the must-run capacities. What are the subsidy schemes? Sometimes that is also important to look into bidding behavior. Because if you have a feed-in tariff, you don't care about the day-ahead prices. If you don't have a feed-in tariff for fluctuating renewables, you might switch off your power plant at prices at zero or lower. So the wind farm, for example, you can't ramp up, but at least you can ramp down. So stuff like that. And that is coming into our decisions of building up this projection for the scenario for all European countries. As again, we have these cross-border flows, we must be able, and we are covering all over Europe in our model. So it's EU 40, we call it always, just to get a glimpse on that, what could happen. But still, Europe is not alone. We are having the oil market, we are having the natural gas market, especially with LNG.
The LNG,
And
of course.
suddenly, if we would make it correct, reduction of complexity of reality, we needed a world model for natural gas, which we don't have. So sometimes we are relying also on external resources, for example, the World Energy Outlook of the International Energy Agency. When it comes to gas development, adapt that a bit because we think that's too low or too high. But sometimes we rely on external resources, but mostly it's internal.
So you have all these scenarios, but to now try to put some likelihood on it, and now I'm also having in mind parties who are entering the physical energy space in Europe. Where do you think that we will be in the next 5 or 10 years? What are going to be the major developments? Is it going to be grid investments? Is it a huge amount of battery penetration, really cutting off the peaks and the dips in the day-ahead price profile? Is it more or less LNG? What does your heart say, Tobias?
Well, I think, and honestly, I'm saying this since 25 years, we will have exciting times ahead. And since 25 years in that, I was always right because every year was somehow exciting. If I look into the next 5 to 10 years, battery will be there. And that is the next hot ... yeah. So battery is really a hot topic. And we will have, in Germany at least, I think, I'm not sure if it's 42 gigawatt grid connection having been approved by the TSOs or even more right now. We do expect that capacity, which is half of the peak demand of Germany, to be connected to the grid. That will have a price impact, but still it will not cannibalize the extreme price spikes in both directions that much, just a bit, as we are still having a growth of fluctuating renewables. So as long as the growth rate of fluctuating renewables is higher than the growth rate of batteries, we still have price volatility. So BESS is there. What is quite interesting with BESS, we do expect lower to no negative prices in the next 4 to 5 years, which is quite interesting. Some other modelers say we still have negative prices. I don't know who's going to be right, but the effect of batteries will be one, especially for PV parks, the market value will increase as they will have more hours with higher prices, at least non-negative prices. So that's interesting. So also PV can be a quite interesting investment case in the future. That is one thing. The other major development, of course, we need to invest into the grid. Grid investments are quite slow. Germany has a quite big package on that. Grid investments, and we also see this in the financial sector, which are mostly our customers, also when it comes to the long-term scenarios. They are looking into infrastructure. It's a bit of a boring system in the end, and as it's within natural monopoly, it's not really sexy, but it could diversify your investment portfolio. What we are not really all aware of, or maybe we are, is another huge impact. And it seems to be a buzzword, but I still see it. It's AI. Especially with data center, not training AI models, but collecting the data and working with the data based on the models we will see a lot of investments into data centers all over Europe, connected to TSO or DSO grids. And we do expect a significant demand increase on electricity due to data centers all over Europe. And that could lead not really to fluctuating, but an increase of the base load demand. They could shift a bit around load demands if you have several data centers, but not that much. But it will increase the total power demand, as we are already speaking, at least in the US, they are, about a scarcity of energy. That's why usually you build a data center with a gas turbine, gas motor, or an SMR, which takes a bit longer than your data center, but that's another discussion. So we see that. Coming back to the climate neutrality, if Germany, for example, wants to be 80% climate neutral or fluctuating renewables of the electricity demand by 2030, if the electricity demand increases due to data center, that will be an even harder job. So AI data center, and that will have an impact on the total demand.
It sounds a bit like a doom scenario of having all these extra data centers there and just politics trying to keep up with meeting green targets, right? We keep on building data centers
Absolutely.
and more renewable production, more grid challenges. And it sounds a bit like a spiral even.
Yeah, well, maybe not a spiral or maybe a rethinking. What was quite interesting, we had a leak in Italy, for example, of a potential decision from the government there that they wanted to reduce price spikes in Italy by really not subsidizing, but substituting the cost what you have in the power generation due to CO2 emissions
That
by, I don't know,
funnily enough
50%, 30.
caused quite a price spike in the market.
Yeah, but a downward
Yes,
spike.
yeah.
And that is interesting, not the spike itself, which is quite clear and has a huge impact. And we can model that, and we modeled it, and we saw, yes, it has an impact for cross-border flow, for the surrounding countries. And usually what you see in the market is a pre-expectation of a fundamental impact. But what is interesting, Maloney's approach was affordability before sustainability. And it could be the initiation. And look into Poland, for example. They say, sorry, we will invest our money not into fluctuating renewables and the green transition. We will invest our money into defense. And this combination, economic growth, military investment, might lead, and the increasing power demand, as you said, might lead to a rethinking of the very strict climate target. Might. Yeah? So that we say 100% 100% climate neutrality by 2045. We might move there to 2060, stuff like that. It will have a huge reaction on a general population, especially in Germany. But speaking about likelihood, it's not that unlikely.
And I think this brings us back to what you said earlier, that the last 25 years you have said it's going to be exciting times ahead of us. And that's what we have seen over the last 25 years and might even see over the next 25 years or many more decades to come. And it's a bit more philosophical or social, but I think that's what binds this energy, all the people in this industry. I said it wrong. That is what binds the people within this industry. It's just the passion and the known that you do not know what's ahead of you, but it's going to be exciting. And what we say to many people who are looking into entering this energy market, it's a trap, but it's a good one. The moment you get into it, you're stuck. You won't get out. And I think that is also confirmed by what you're saying, Tobias, that it was your 26th e-world, and it's still a joy to be there, right?
Absolutely, it is and always great and exciting also how it developed. And I mean, when you see the younger people and also when we're hiring new entries to the market, what they often say is, I would like to have a purpose and an impact. And still today, even if we see that the market has grown, and when I started, it was just a few people around. Now the market has grown, but you still can have a purpose and an impact to the market. Still can move things, and it's not boring. Of course, we are a bit stuck and locked into the energy itself, but energy is huge. It's not only power, then it's natural gas, then it's a technology, then it's a renewable. It might be nuclear, it might be the grid. So, and in the end, and that's maybe as an interesting word. How important power is, we only can see once it's missing. As I'm based in Berlin, we had a blackout in a region where my family used to live, or my ex-wife with my kids is living, and they were affected by the blackout. And suddenly you see in the wintertime how important electricity is. It seems to be always there, and it's so normal, but it's the same with water, for example. Yeah. But once it's missing, you see, oh shoot, we should have done a lot of things.
Yeah. And then you realize how important it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Tobias, I would like to thank you very much today. We had a very interesting talk and running out of time here now. Also to the audience, in case you want to be in touch, have more vision on either the history or the future of energy, specifically in the German market, please reach out to Tobias, and I'm sure he's willing to help you ahead. So, Tobias, thank you very much for today, for being here with us. I really enjoyed the talk. I hope you did as well.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure, Paul, and cool.
Thank you very much.